Dear friends, how do you do? My name is Tamara Kutsaeva and I'm a historian from Kyiv. I'm going to present you results of my research, memories of Polish reading culture of the modern era in the reflections of Polish provenance marks of the second half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. This research was done in the frame of the scholarship Badaj na Ukrainie from Centrum Dialogu імені Juliusza Mieroszewskiego, Poland. So if you are interested in European culture, in the history of Ukrainian-Polish cultural dialogue and provenance marks, please stay with me during this presentation. Before to start, I would like to show you the postcard of the city of Radom, 1915, one antiquarian bookshop, which stamp I studied during my research worked in this city. This postcard is originated from the collection of the National Historical Architectural Museum, the Fortress of Kyiv. It was attributed by Olena Datsuk for her own research of Polish postcards during the same scholarship Badaj na Ukrainie. So, the city of Radom, Warsaw, and other Polish cities are joined with Ukraine and Kyiv. We are owners of different historical libraries. These libraries were identified in the library of the National Museum of History of Ukraine. So, searching traces of different historical Polish libraries, I studied the collection of the National Museum of History of Ukraine and collections of 29 other libraries, museums, and archives in 4 states: in Ukraine, in Poland, in Lithuania, and the USA. All this work was done in the remote format, so I am really appreciative to many institutions and professionals for their cordial support. More than 200 antiquarian books were studied, and 52 Polish provenance marks were identified. There are different types of ex libris, library stamps, stamps of booksellers and book binders, signatures of owners of books, and different gift inscriptions. Talking about the results of my research, I would like to say that a lot of the studied books were presented at a very interesting exhibition in the National Museum of History of Ukraine 2 years ago, but few attention was paid to the Polish provenance mark. So it is a very wide opportunity to study them and to present new knowledge. Here you see best, not the best, but the brightest samples of Polish intellectual thought reflected in old printed books that were found in the library of the museum and studied. Here you can see 2 interesting and bright books that were found, and to the left there is the very important work of Maximilian Asalinsky and August Belowski called Historical and Critical Information on the History of Polish Literature. It was issued since 1819 until 1852 in Krakow and in Lviv, and here you can see pages of this book with nice illustrations, and also here you can see the picture of Maximilian Asalinsky, who founded Osolinsky Institute in Lviv, one of the biggest Polish library and one of the most famous Ukrainian library. So work of Maximilian Osolinsky is a very bright story about intellectuals of the 19th century who represented Polish and Ukrainian cultural heritage. Important provenance marks of Maximilian Osolinsky and his institute were studied during my research. And talking about historical libraries, I would like to present you two parts of this research. The first part is joined by private libraries, and the second part of my research is joined by libraries of different families and dynasties of Polish magnates. The first story, the first but not the last, is the story of August Iwanski, who was born in Cherkasy region in the late of the 19th century. He became a patron of music and culture, and he also participated in the January uprising of 1863-64 that was aimed to reconstruction of political, economical, and civil rights of the Polish lands in the frame of the Russia Empire. August Iwanski was arrested, and during 2 months he was a prisoner of the Kyiv fortress here in Kyiv, and later he spent 10 years in Siberia. After those years, he obtained the right to return to the European part of the Russian Empire, but he lost all his privileges and rights, and later he immigrated to Poland. In the center of the picture, you can see the book stamp of August Iwanski that joined his signature and the library stamp. This book was identified in the library of Maximovich in Kyiv, and another August Iwanski library stamp also was identified in the library of the National Museum of History of Ukraine. So the story of August Iwanski is not only the story of the private library, it's also the story about the political history of Poland in the frame of the Russia Empire. The next private library belonged to Jan Mitkevich. His biography is almost unknown. Still, I do not know who he was. It is proved that he was the head of the General Post Office in Warsaw, but also maybe he was one of the first travelers in America, one of the first Polish travelers to America. And Jan Mitkevich had a very interesting provenance mark. Here you can see this library stamp that in real is the coat of arms ex libris made by a stamp. And Jan Mitkevich became rather rich man. He obtained the possibility to collect very nice and very expensive library. And later he lost all his money and had to sell his books and his property. So later this book to the left, a very nice old printed book issued in Amsterdam, was bought by another prominent Ukrainian, Varvara Khanenko, and later it was sent to the library of Vladimir Vernadsky in Kyiv. So here you see that Jan Mitkevich had the possibility to collect very bright and interesting library, but we still do not know in which circumstances he could to do this, but nevertheless his story is interesting and needed to be studied more. And today in Ukraine, we have only 2 books that are like a small memory about this known and unknown man who was able to form his own library and to form his own reading habit and reading tradition here in Ukraine or maybe in Poland, because still it is unknown how most books appeared in Kyiv in the library of the National Museum of History of Ukraine, as almost all documents about the library lost during the Second World War. And the third private library in my research belonged to the colonel Vladimir Boguslavsky from the city of Riga. Very few is known about Vladimir Boguslavsky. He liked collecting of books. He preferred to buy French old printed books, but one day he had also to sell everything he had and to left the city of Riga very quickly. But his library is very interesting for us because only he had this type of ex libris, paper coat of arm ex libris, so-called sticker. And here you can see this bright sticker from the collection in Sweden. And I should say that ex libris of Vladimir Boguslavsky is only the coat of arm and paper ex libris in the whole Polish collection in the National Museum of History of Ukraine. So here we can study the personal story of Vladimir Boguslavsky and the story, not the story, but the history of ex libris and different types of ex libris. The next private library belonged to Karol Bolsunovsky. Karol Bolsunovsky was one of the most prominent collectors and museologists of Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century. He got a lot of money from his uncle and aunt and bought a house in Kyiv and spent his time collecting books and studying archaeology. Some years before the First World War, Karol Bolsunovsky ordered this bright and excellent ex libris for his archaeology department of the library. And here you can see a lot of symbols connected with Karol Bolsunovsky and his dynasty, but also Vladimir Yeremich, famous Ukrainian artist, also performed the image of Karol Bolsunovsky in this paper ex libris. This paper ex libris was found in the National Museum of Arts of Ukraine by Larisa Amelina 10 years ago and studied by this researcher. In the collection of the National Museum of History of Ukraine, only one book from the rich library of Karol Bolsunovsky was found. That book is with the signature and gift inscription of Karol Bolsunovsky. Story of Karol Bolsunovsky is very sad. During the Soviet times, he lost almost all. He starved and he had to sell his books and parts of his collection. In one letter to his friend Dmitro Drozdov, he said, "Some days ago I sold some books and I got some grain instead of my books." So the library of Karol Bolsunovsky is almost lost during sad and dark Soviet times. Karol Bolsunovsky died in 1924 and his grave also was lost during 2 world wars. The next part of my research is connected with provenance marks of family and dynasty libraries. And this story is also very, very interesting. And the first library that I would like to present is Biblioteca Wilanowska. This Biblioteca Wilanowska was formed by representatives of the Potocki dynasty in Poland, and later this library, this great library, was delivered to Wilanowski Palace in Warsaw. Until the Second World War, it was one of the greatest libraries of the state. After the Second World War, everything that was saved during the war was presented to the Poland as the gift from the dynasty, and today Wilanowska Biblioteka Wilanowska is one of the treasures of Poland. Here also you can see the metal stamp, and such a stamp, not exactly the stamp, but the mark, the provenance mark made by the stamp, was also found on one book in the library of the National Museum of History of Ukraine. It is absolutely unclear and unknown how the book from Poland appeared in Kyiv. It is a very interesting and specific story to be researched, but only one book from this library in Kyiv led to study a lot about this great dynasty and its participation in development of cultural space of Poland of the 19th century. The next library belonged to the family of Witold and Maria Świętopolk-Czetwertyński here in Ukraine, in the city of Dashev. Witold Świętopolk-Czetwertyński also participated in the January uprising of 1836-1834, and he spent more than 10 years in the exile on the territory of the Caucasus Mountains. After that, he returned home in Ukraine and met his future wife, Maria Potocka. After the marriage, they built and developed their palace in the city of Dashev. There they formed their own archive and library. And to the right on the picture, you can see a very interesting type of ex libris belong to the family. Here you can read the cabinet of Ясновельможний князь, the study of Świętopolk-Czetwertyński. It means that books with this provenance mark were saved in Świętopolk-Czetwertyński cabinet, in his study, not in the library. So it means that he wanted some books in the very close to his everyday life and wanted to read them as quick as it was possible. Świętopolk-Czetwertyński and his wife Maria left their property to different relatives, but during the First World War, their palace in the city of Dashev library and most property was destroyed and robbed. Only few books were saved, and today in Kyiv, they are in the Museum of the History of Ukraine and also in the Historical Library of Ukraine. So here we see one more sad story of Polish cultural heritage that was destroyed during the First World War and forgotten and also lost during the Soviet times. And the next library, library stamp that exactly is also ex libris belonged to the Tyzenhaus dynasty. The Tyzenhaus dynasty also didn't connect it with Ukraine. Some of their property was evacuated in Kyiv in 1915, but here their property was lost and no one knows where it was for many, many years. Only some years ago, the portrait of Constanta Tyzenhaus and one book belonged to his dynasty were found in Kyiv. The portrait of Constanta Tyzenhaus was found in the National Museum of Arts of Ukraine, and the book with this interesting ex libris that is in the center of the picture was found in the collection of the National Museum of History of Ukraine. So here we see that people who wanted to save their property during the First World War lost it here in Ukraine, also during the war and next complicated processes connected with Bolsheviks' power. And also one more private library connected with Ukraine is the private library of the dynasty of Vladimir Didushytsky. Later, this private library turned in one of the most famous Polish and Lviv libraries. Vladimir Didushytsky presented the library of his dynasty to the city of Lviv. And here you see the cabinet of Vladimir Didushytsky that now is a reading hall of this library in Lviv. In the center, you can see the library stamp of Vladimir Didushytsky with his name WD and this name Biblioteka Potuzhitska. Many noble dynasties libraries also were called by names of cities or villages where they were found. As the dynasty of Didushytsky here in Ukraine had their property in the village of Potuzhitsa, Lvivska Oblast, they called their biblioteka, their book collection, Biblioteka Potuzhitska, and this also is very interesting to be noticed. And also, I would like to tell you one more story connected with the January uprising and the Kyiv fortress here in Kyiv. There is the story of Józef Popovsky family. This was the family library collected by Julian Popovsky and his two sons. And their library was formed in the village of Zalivanshina on the territory of Vinnytska Oblast, so Biblioteka was called Biblioteka Zalivanska. And here you can see Novina coat of arms belonged to the Popovsky dynasty, and also this coat of arms is very, very famous and well known in Ukraine, as Ukrainian hetman Pilip Orlik also used this coat of arms. And here you can see his personal stamp that now is in the collection of Sweden archive. So Biblioteka Zalivanska also was formed by not very rich, not very prominent Polish family, but this family is a part of the Ukrainian and the Polish society, and their story is important and interesting. Józef Popovsky became the member of groups that were preparing the January uprising with the aim to return political, economical, and civil rights of Poland in the frame of the Russian Empire. Empire. Józef Popovsky was arrested and spent 2 long years in the prison of Kyiv fortress. Later, he and his friends spent more than 10 years in Siberia. After long years, Józef Popovsky obtained the right to return to the European lands, but he lost all his privileges and left Ukraine forever. He immigrated to Galician, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he had the bright military and political career. In Ukraine, I found only one book from his rather big library, and this should be noticed too. And the last story that I would like to present you is connected with Biblioteka Brzozowskiego, or Biblioteka of the Brzozowski dynasty. This dynasty also lived on the territory of Vinnytsia Oblast, Vinnytsia region, in the village of Sokolovka. They also had the property in Odessa. Brzozowski were rich. They formed one of the brightest art collection and very rich library. Zenon Isidor Brzozowski, his signature from books is to the right, became a very prominent resident of Odessa. He also became famous diplomat of the Poland, and he was the head of the embassy of Poland in Odessa in 1818, not 1818, I'm sorry, in 1918, 1919. And in the center of the picture, you can see Sergei Adamovich Brzozowski. Maybe he was the last representatives of the Brzozowski dynasty in Ukraine. He spent last of his years in the city of Zhytomyr, where he married with Maria Kopachevska. Together they studied flora and fauna of Volyn and participated in creation of modern Zhytomyr Lore Museum. The Brzozowski family in Zhytomyr saved some books from the great library of their dynasty. And after many, many years, in the mid of 1960s, the nephew of Maria Kopachevska, the wife of Sergei Brzozowski, presented 13 books belong to Brzozowski to the Museum of History of Ukraine and to the National Historical Library of Ukraine. So only some memories about this library, about this great family were saved in Ukrainian museums and cultural institutions. But it is also very important, as every historical library, even if it is represented only one book, is very important, as it is the possibility to remember reading cultures, reading habits, not only of the modern era, but of the last of the history and of the past that was brutally changed by the First World War and Bolsheviks terror here in Ukraine. So during my research of Polish reading cultures in the reflection of provenance marks, I have prepared the book that will be shared with this presentation for free, and I welcome you to read it and to send your comments and critics to the author. And also I will be appreciate for additional information and visual materials that will make this story more interesting and to be represented in more details. Thank you very much for your attention.